Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the first of two webinars sponsored by the Crash Modification Factors Clearinghouse team. This webinar today is targeted to practitioners, and then next week we'll host a similar webinar for researchers. The purpose of these webinars is to update you on the change to the rating system we use to assess the quality of CMFs in the Clearinghouse. We implemented this change earlier this week on the CMF Clearinghouse website on Monday, February 15th. And so we'll spend the next hour reviewing changes to the website, specific details about the new rating criteria, and address any questions that you might have. Before we get started, I wanted to review just a couple of housekeeping items. First, if for some reason your computer or web browser freezes during the webinar today, just reload the website and log back into the program. You should be able to rejoin this session, no problem. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll post the recording as well as the PowerPoint and written responses to any questions that we're not able to get to back to the CMF Clearinghouse website in the next couple of days. We have also muted everyone's audio for today's webinar. We do expect a large number of attendees on today's call, so by muting your audio, that helps us cut down on any confusion and background noise. And then as an attendee, you have a control panel in the upper right corner of your screen that collapses and expands by clicking the red arrow. Though you will be muted, you will have the ability to ask questions by entering them in the question box located within the control panel. Please feel free to ask questions related to the presentation as we go along by typing them into that box, and we'll answer those questions at the end of the presentation today. If you have any problems during the webinar, you can also chat with us here and see if we can help you resolve any issues that you might have. We also have questions that we'll be asking you throughout the presentation today using the poll feature in the webinar software. And we're going to start with the first one just to make sure that you're all on board and paying attention. And this will help us get to know you better. So Kelly, if you could bring up that first poll question. Please respond to this poll question to let us know your employer type. If you're with academia, if you're with the private sector, if you're with state or federal agency, a regional or local agency, or if you're with the other agency, maybe you could just tell us what that is in the chat pod. So we'll give this just another couple of seconds. Okay, Kelly, do you want to close that up and summarize the results for us?
Yeah, it looks like we have 50% private, 33% state and federal, 13% regional and local, 1% other, and 2% academic. Okay,
great. Thank you. So now that we know a little bit about you, let me introduce you to today's presenters, starting with myself. I am Karen Scurry. I am with Federal Highway's Headquarters Office of Safety and the Federal Highway Manager for the CMF Clearinghouse. I'm also joined today by Jerry Roche, also in the Office of Safety. Jerry is the Data-Driven Safety Analysis Program Manager in our office. And then we have John McFadden and Dave Petrucci with our Resource Center's Technical Services Team for Safety and Design. I also want to mention that we have Taha and Srini from the University of North Carolina's Highway Safety Research Center with us today as well. They're not presenters today, but they are online to answer any hard questions that you guys might have. They're both on the CMF Clearinghouse team with us, as well as on the NCHRP 1772 project team. So for today's webinar, Jerry will kick us off with a quick review of where you can find information about the new rating system on the Clearinghouse website. And then we'll turn it over to John to get into some of the technical details about the new rating system and walk through a couple of examples. And then Dave has put together some FAQs that he'll share, and then he'll help round up your questions from the question box for a Q&A session. And then we'll save the last couple of minutes of today's webinar and for me to wrap things up. So before I turn it over to Jerry, we have one more poll question for you. This is not the last one, but this is the last one before we get into things. And so Kelly, if you can bring up this poll question. Just trying to get a feel for how often you use the CMF Clearinghouse. Do you use it daily, weekly, monthly, once or twice per year, or have you never used in the CMF Clearinghouse? I can't believe that would be anybody's response. So we'll just give you a few more seconds to finish this up. Okay, Kelly, do you want to close that and summarize the results for us?
Yeah, so we have 42% said once or twice per year, 40% monthly, 10% weekly, 7% never, and 1% daily.
Okay, I'm surprised there are so many that said never. So for those of you that have never used the CMF Clearinghouse, I would encourage you to go to the website and explore a little bit. There are lots of resources to help you understand the CMF Clearinghouse. The webinar that we hosted this past December provided an overview of CMFs as well as the CMF Clearinghouse, and so that might be a good place to start if you've never used the CMF Clearinghouse, just to give you a quick intro to that, because we're going to get pretty into the weeds pretty quickly here today. So with that, I will turn it over to Jerry to give you an overview of the changes to the CMF Clearinghouse website.
Thanks, Karen. It certainly was good to do that poll just to have some idea of how often folks have been in there. So I'm going to give you just a real brief overview of the CMF Clearinghouse changes that have been made on the website. For those that haven't been in there, that 7%, this will maybe give you a quick overview of what's on there. So this is the landing page. When you go to it, it's of course the website is there at the bottom, cmfclearinghouse.org. And so if you are a familiar user, if you've been in there regularly, on the right column there, the right box, it used to say changes ahead. And so now that says updated ratings. And so that, as Karen mentioned, these changes went live on Monday. And so, but there's kind of an overview of information that's provided if you click on that. While we're here, I'll just mention too some of the other additional resources up at the top that you see. For those that are new, there's information about how to use the clearinghouse. There's a user's guide in there. There's even some short videos that explain that. So there's also information on how to use a CMF or develop CMFs if you're new to this. And then also some additional resources, particularly for state DOTs. You know, some states have their own lists that they've created, state-specific lists on CMFs that they want their agencies, their counterparts, as well as their local agencies to use when they're applying for safety projects, for example. So all that information is contained on the clearinghouse, and just a wealth of information for you. So talking about some of the updated rating changes, we'll go ahead and go through this. If you click on that third box, this will come up. There is a flyer that kind of talks about the star ratings and what we mean by the star ratings. For those that are new, the star ratings is really the sort of a quick at a glance quality rating of the CMF, the crash modification factor that you're interested in. Similar to when you're on any shopping site where you see the star ratings, it gives you a sort of a quick assessment of the product and how rigorous the analysis behind that product is. And so there's some flyers there. There's a spreadsheet. This allows you to actually compare the legacy star ratings and the updated star ratings. We'll give you an example of that here in a second. So all that information is contained in there. We also talk about the rating procedures and how actually each individual item is scored. And I think that we talk about that on the next page here. I think first we'll show you the spreadsheet. This is just a quick screenshot of the spreadsheet. There you see the CMF ID number. Each CMF in the clearinghouse has a unique ID. I think we're up to the IDs getting into the 10,000 range for all our different CMFs. You see the old star rating there, the legacy rating. And then also you see the updated star rating. And so some cases, those are going to stay the same. In about half of the cases, those are different now. And so this is a great spreadsheet. If you have a state CMF list, you certainly want to look at this to see what has changed. We included all of the different attributes for the CMFs in this spreadsheet. So I think there's over 60 columns that include information, and then again, 10,000 rows or so of information. So check that out. That is something you can share, particularly if you have vendors or others in the state. That might be a great resource for them. So as I mentioned, we actually also talk about the star quality ratings. For each of the different types of studies, we talk about the total points that are available and how those points are divvied up, as you see there. There's a few more here. And then we actually get into the details of those scores and how many points are available. for those different sections of points. And so this can be useful for you as you go through. You'll see how these are rated. We actually have some star corolla ratings. I think on the next screen we talk about pulling up a CMF. When you type in a CMF, or if you're doing a search, and this one in particular is for conversion of intersection to a roundabout, we show the CMF values, but we also show the star quality rating, and you can actually click on that view score details. This one in particular scored at 85 points, and you pull that up, and it actually gives you a breakdown. And so again, looking at those different scoring criteria, it shows how many points that this particular study received. And so you see in the early parts there's not a lot of details for some of the reference and comparison group information, and so they didn't receive a lot of points for those. But when they got into looking at the actual performance of before and after crashes, it scored quite well and got a lot of those points. And so we provided this really for transparency purposes. This gives you, I think, as a user or practitioner, more information about how a CMF was scored and something you want to look at for your site criteria. It also helps provide some transparency for those researchers that maybe helped develop a CMF. It's possible that as we comb through the various source of information, that we missed some of the information in the research report that we reviewed. There might be some information that wasn't provided, and so it didn't score well. Those can be modified if the researcher is able to provide supplemental information, or if we just got it wrong. That's an opportunity for us to improve that in the future. So going on, I think we talk a little bit about just you want to be familiar with the new criteria, and so spend some time studying that if you have an opportunity, and determine how this might impact you in your job. Particularly, as I mentioned, the state CMF lists, those values might be different. The star rating and the criteria has changed, so you might want to take another look at those. I know in some states they may have a star rating criteria as a threshold, and they might say 3 stars or above. Well, with those star ratings changing, you certainly want to think about that and maybe get a better sense of those changes if that's how your agency handles the star ratings. So I think with that, we have another poll question, Karen, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Jerry. So Kelly, if you can open up this next poll question before we turn it over to John. We just want to get a feel for how important the CMF star quality rating is to you and your work on a scale of 1, not important, to 5, very important. We'll give you just a few more seconds to complete this poll. And Kelly, if you could close that and summarize the results.
So we have 52% somewhat important, 37% said very important, 8% said indifferent, 2% less important, 1% said less important, and 2% said unimportant.
Okay, so a majority of folks think that the star quality rating is very important and somewhat important, and I think we heard that before. We made plans to make this transition, and is one of the reasons that we wanted to maintain that star quality rating. So I'm going to turn it over to John now so he can get into the details of the new rating system and how that translates to the star quality rating in the CMF Clearinghouse.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, if you could hit to the next slide. Okay, just a quick review, as Jerry touched on a little bit. The current star rating system, and when I say current, I mean the previous star rating system that was in place up until this week, was established at the inception of the original clearinghouse when it was first opened up to the public back in 2009. Now, in the meantime, we've been evaluating the performance of this rating system, and as a result of that, an NCHRP study was initiated, NCHRP 1772, that examined the rating system that was in place from the clearinghouse's inception up through 2018 or so. And what was found was that there's opportunities to improve upon the existing star rating criteria, and that's in essence what 1772 attempted to accomplish. And the goal here was to have the new criteria in place for the release of the second edition of the Highway Safety Manual, and it is going to be included in that release. In fact, as Karen mentioned, it was just released publicly as of Monday of this week onto the website the Clearinghouse is located, and you can take a look at that as we will in the upcoming slides. And we'll now take a look at the rating scheme. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so the old scheme was a single rating scheme for all types of studies, before, after, cross-sectional, meta-analysis, or meta-regression. And regardless of study type, there were 5 criteria used to establish the star rating, and then there were corresponding weights as illustrated on this slide. Study design had a weight of 2, sample size a weight of 2, and then standard error, potential bias, and data source, each were weighted with 1 unit. Points were then assigned to each of these criteria based on the level of rigor. So if the criteria exceeded the standard, they received an excellent rating. If it was at the fair or at the standard expected level, you get a fair rating. And if it didn't meet the criteria at all, it got 0 points. So from that, going to the next slide, you'll see when taking these points, applying them to that overall score equation, you then summed up the values to get the total points for a specific study that was done to produce a CMF, and that score then is linked to the star rating as illustrated with the bins shown here. I want to touch on this initially here to make sure that this message is communicated. This star rating and the evaluation of these studies are not intended to create a reflection on the researchers. Rather, it's more likely to be an indication of the resources and data that were available to the researchers. And that's going to be the same for the old system that we're showing here, as well as the new one, which we're going to talk about in a couple seconds here. So you can see here, for a 5-star rating under the old system, you would need 14 points, which is the maximum number, and there were very few 5-star CMFs. And this is often a result of very few of the CMF studies included multiple states. Okay, so this leads us now, go ahead to the next slide, and we'll take a look at the changes now to the new rating system as a result of the NCHRP 1772 study. So this study, the objectives were to assess the criteria that was in place from the inception for the clearinghouse for that 5-star rating using the 5 criteria. And then based on that assessment, if appropriate, establish revisions and new criteria and incorporate that in to the process to establish a new set of criteria to establish, to quantify the star rating. And that's in essence what occurred. Before revealing the explicit criteria, what you'll notice is breaking the CMF down by study type is going to be one of the main results of this 1772 study. It is on a granular level easier to evaluate a CMF based on the type of study that was used to create it. And within each of these different study types, there's a set of criteria that is unique and appropriate to evaluate how well the study was conducted for that type, as we'll look at here into the next slide. Okay, so now the rating system that was developed through 1772 is more detailed. It provides scores for different factors that include sample size, study design, as I mentioned, the methodology, as well as in terms of statistical significance that we'll touch on a little bit more. So the separate rating criteria was developed for before, after versus cross-sectional versus meta-analysis and meta-regression studies. And what we'll do is go to the website after we're done with the PowerPoint here to illustrate some of these points. Or I think we pulled some still images from the website. And I encourage you, once we're done with this webinar, to go to the clearinghouse and surf around to see exactly what it is we're discussing here today. In fact, now if you have access to it, it may also be appropriate to do that. But generally speaking here, the overall procedure establishes a new criteria. The total possible points that you can achieve under this new rating system is now 150. And it increased as a result of a new scoring criteria, but as well additional metrics or parameters that are being evaluated based on the different study types that are used to produce the CMS. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here, for instance, for before, after, and cross-sectional studies, you can see the rating criteria is based on these categories. The factors include the data, and within the data, they're examining the study in terms of how many miles or sites were used. For those miles of highway or sites that were used, how many crashes occurred for both the reference and comparison sites versus the treated sites. Now, in examining these different categories, you could achieve a total of 55 points. The second factor that's examined is study method, or study design, and statistical methodology, which are being evaluated for their abilities to account for potential biases, trends, and the appropriateness of the statistical procedures. And you can see the weight for this, or the total points that you can obtain for these factors, are 75. And then statistical significance. And this is a reflection of to what extent has the CMF, along with the standard error, been found to be statistically significant. So the criteria for this is, in essence, a level of confidence, or the term you'll see on the website is alpha, which is the significance level. 1 minus alpha gives you the confidence level. So if you're at a 95% confidence level or above for the statistical significance, or your alpha or significant level is 0.05 or less, you would get the full 20 points. Between 0.05 to 0.10, which corresponds to 90 to 95% confidence level, you get 15 points. 85 to 90% confidence, which is alpha of 0.10 to 0.15, would be 10 points, and then 80 to 85%, which is 0.15 to 0.20 for alpha or significance level, you'd get 5 points. Anything below that would be 0. And that the criteria for these before, after, and cross-sectional studies can be found on the website. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. Now you'll see the rating criteria for meta-analysis studies. Again, there's some overlap here. For instance, statistical significance is the same criteria for the meta-analysis studies. However, when you look at the other factors, some include some changes based on the study type. So for the methodology and data, the subcategories include the consistent methodology, crash type, and severity definitions across the included studies. And examining that, you could achieve a total of 55 points. The CMF quality, for the meta-analysis, for the studies that were used, the quality of those studies, the standard errors of the individual CMFs that were used in the meta-analysis, the combination of those studies can yield as high as 35 points. And then for combining these studies together, the appropriate methods that were used to estimate the combined CMF accounts for 40 total points within this criteria. Okay, go ahead to the next slide. We'll look at the next study group, which is meta-regression. And for this, again, for the methodology and data, again, the consistent methodology, crash type, severity definitions across the studies were included and accounts for 55 points. The quality of the CMF based on the studies that were used and the standard errors for the individual CMFs and pulling them together accounts for 35 total points. And then the appropriate of the statistical analysis conducted to estimate the crash modification function, including the appropriate model and functional forms, accounts for 60 total points. And you can see there's some subtle differences across the different study types that then bring us, once you've computed the 1772 rating score, these bins now establish the criteria for the star rating. So you can see 135 to 150 total points for your study would yield a CMF star rating of 5 under this new rating system. And then as you proceed down the bins to 0 to 34 points would be a 1-star rating. So now a key question the researchers had in the transition from the old to the new rating system, what changes would impact, or excuse me, let me rephrase that. How would the existing CMFs scoring under the old system score in comparison under the new system? And that was what we evaluated and are showing here on this slide. In essence, we wanted to examine how much change would occur in the rating of existing CMFs in place. And what we found is that approximately 50% of the CMFs remained the same star rating from the old to the new rating system. And a little over 50%. That leaves a little less than 50% experiencing changes. And with that, it was really important for the clearinghouse team to communicate effectively and be totally transparent in how the changes and what the changes were. So if you go to the next slide, we show a couple examples of this in terms of the illustrative impact. Oh, go back to that slide real quick, Karen. I just want to make sure I covered everything on that bullet. I got ahead of myself. Yeah, 52% of the CMFs remain under the current star rating. And 16%, this is the one thing that did concern our team, was the current 16% of the CMFs currently rated at 3 stars or better would be rated at 2 stars or lower. And those CMFs, what was found was when you examine and compare the criteria, it was often, there was some information that was either unknown or missing from the study that led to this reduction because of the additional criteria that are included under the new system. Okay, Karen, now we can jump to those couple examples here. And this is example ratings under the two systems. So here on the top of the slide, you'll see the old rating system where the study design here for the CMF yielded 2 points, sample size 2 points, standard error 2 points, potential bias 2 points, data source 2 points, which for this CMF yielded a perfect score, which is very rare under that old system. It had a 5-star rating. Now, when we take that same CMF and apply it to the new star rating, you would see all 10s for the first criteria, and then for the confidence or the significance level, 20, accounting for regression to the mean, 25 points, spillover, crash migration, 5. This also gets the full 150 total points, or equivalent of 5-star rating. Okay, so this was a success case where for the CMF ID 8441, the old system had a 5-star rating. It had a perfect score under the old system. Under the 1772 rating system, the current new rating system, it had a perfect score, win-win, no substantial change, all is well in the world. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so here CMF ID 460. The old system, 5-star rating was achieved for this CMF. However, under the 1772 rating system, it achieved a 1-star rating. So the old system, it was clear, it got the full number of points for each criteria under those 5 criteria we talked about earlier. However, under the new system, because of the gaps that existed, there was missing information related to these different elements that yielded no points. So when we summed up all that information, the total number of points based on the study information provided for CMF 460 was 30 total points under the new system, or a 1-star rating. Again, it is not intended to be a reflection on the researchers, but rather the resources available and data available to those researchers that produced this CMF. Now, we will touch on this as well. Information may come in after the fact, where we can adjust these to reflect new data that comes in related to this CMF. So these star ratings can be adjusted to reflect new information that comes in later. Okay, next slide, Karen. Okay, here's CMF ID 318, where under the old system it was a 1-star rating, and it became a 3-star CMF under the 1772 rating. So the additional criteria that's established under 1772 that was included in the CMF 318 study, which at this granular level, the new criteria was able to pick up and use the information that was provided by the authors and researchers. However, the old criteria didn't have as fine or granular the ability to include or recognize the additional analytical approaches applied. So that's really the strength, is we're able to, at a much more granular level, evaluate how well and what data were used in the production of the CMF. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to turn it over here to ask a question to the group as it relates to, after seeing these new ratings for the different study types, to what extent do you think that they will impact you and or your customers? So if you could take a minute, and I'll turn it back over to you, Karen, to close out.
Okay, thank you, John. I appreciate you going through the details of the new rating system. I think that's probably of most interest to the folks online today. And we'll give you just a few more seconds to respond to this poll question. And Kelly, if you can close that out and summarize the results.
Sure. We had 42% said yes, likely, but not in a significant way. 25% said yes, definitely. 16% no, it's unlikely. 0% said no, absolutely not. And 16% said I'm not sure.
Yep. And
so the majority said yes, definitely, or yes, likely.
Right. And I think that's consistent with what we heard as we were, we had some focus groups and stakeholder groups to see what resources we could develop that would be helpful to you as you, I guess, as we implemented this transition. And I think that's consistent with what we heard from our stakeholders, is that yes, it will be an impact, but maybe not in a significant way. So that's good. Thank you for taking the time to provide that feedback. And we tried to develop as many resources as we could to help you through this transition, but we will have another poll closer to the end of the time today to see if there's anything else that we can do to help you with that. But before then, I did want to turn it over to Dave now to walk through some answers to some frequently asked questions, and then to see what questions you guys have, see how we can help you through this transition process.
Great, thank you, Karen. And again, thank you everyone for being part of today's webinar. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Next slide, Karen. So I'm going to attempt to offer up some perhaps popular, if not frequently asked questions about this transition, and what really we're looking at now is the rating system of crash modification factors on today's clearinghouse. These may not be all of your questions, so I do encourage you to go ahead and take advantage of the question and answer feature here today to pose your questions, and I'll run through a few, and we'd like to reserve the balance of our time together for your questions and a bit of a discussion there, and then Karen will wrap up today's webinar. So what should you do next, if anything? This is the big loaded question. And really, in all honesty, it depends. But it's safe to say that if you, your projects, and your organization are using crash modification factors from the clearinghouse, and they could be used in a myriad of ways, and their star quality ratings are important to you, they're of interest, then we do recommend and we encourage you to review the changes that we've discussed today, go onto the clearinghouse and investigate those details and the potential changes, and all the while continue to use the clearinghouse and select the most appropriate crash modification factors for your projects as you would define them. If you have the advantage of perhaps a list of crash modification factors that you need to resort to, perhaps you have a state maintained list or a jurisdictionally approved list of crash modification factors that we know many of our customers have developed, and you are basing some of the information on that list on the star quality rating, it would be valuable to reinvestigate and take a look. Because as John pointed out, about half of the crash modification factors on the clearinghouse are experiencing a star quality change. We're seeing most of those star quality ratings go up or down by 1 star, but it's safe to say that we are seeing a number that you probably use that would be experiencing a change. Next slide, please. So if you are interested in more details, John covered this. Jerry showed you earlier in today's webinar where you can find more of the details, but please, when you're on the clearinghouse and you're viewing the specific crash modification factor, crash reduction factor report, you're looking at that report on the clearinghouse. To the right of the star quality rating, you would see some big words, view score details. If you select that, you would see the list of score details showing the rating, the inputs, the outputs, the updated score according to the applicable study type. And that's where you can find a bit more details on a CMF by CMF basis. If you're interested in finding more details about the changes in the new rating system, there's also another section on the website specific to that. So you would go to About the Clearinghouse and go down to Star Rating or Star Quality Rating. We have a great page there that's full of a lot of the information that we've covered today that can explain the current, i.e. the new rating system. So next slide, please, Karen. And another question that we've expected that we have been asked is whether or not we've actually changed the crash modification factors themselves. And the answer is no. The CMF, CRF values themselves, that information remains the same. The only change that we're looking at are the updated score and resultant star quality ratings using the new rating system that we've presented on during today's webinar. Next slide, please. So will we still have access to the previous or the legacy star quality ratings, those that may be right now already referenced in a lot of your reports and in a lot of your work and the products that you're using? The answer is yes, you will still have access to what was the previous star quality rating or legacy rating. You can access that information by going to the clearinghouse and going to the URL found here below. And if you click on that, you'll find a 15 megabyte plus size Excel spreadsheet that's full of essentially a data download from the clearinghouse right before the transition happened that includes both the old and the new star quality ratings. It is important to note that crash modification factors added to the clearinghouse after the transition date, which was February 15, they will be rated using this new system. And I thought I would be keen to point that out right now. Next slide, please, Karen. And I want to wrap up this and then kind of turn things over to your questions, and we'll do our best to answer those. But this is also a challenging question, but in short, is this new system better? There's a lot that we could get into. A lot of materials already been covered, but the new rating system is considered by our team to be more rigorous and objective than what we had before, the previous legacy rating system. And while the updated score and rating are important, and they are an indication of the quality of the study, really the amount and quality of the data that went into the study that perhaps could be the result of the budget of the study exercise itself. And like John mentioned, that's not a reflection of the researcher's work, but rather the resources afforded to the researcher for that project. At any rate, while those star quality ratings and scores are important, they are not the only factor that should be involved in your selection and use of crash modification factors from the clearinghouse. And we do want to make it a point to emphasize that it's very important to select appropriate crash modification factors as you would deem that, using all relevant information, including the star quality rating. So with that, I'd like to open things up to your questions and answers. There are several that are in the question and answer pod here that we're looking at, and we'll do our best to start answering those and going through those. So with that, while we start looking at these questions and beginning to answer them, Karen, I wanted to turn the mic over to you for a moment and see if there's anything else that you would like to say before we jump into this portion of the webinar.
Oh, let's get to those questions, Dave.
All right, great. All right, so there's a question here, and we answered a few questions already earlier before we got to this portion of the webinar, but we have a question from Stephen. Stephen is asking, do you think these rating changes will affect which crash modification factors are currently in the Highway Safety Manual and which are included in the next edition of the Highway Safety Manual? And I'd like to put that question over to our presenters here today. John, Jerry, Karen, who would like to take a stab at answering that question from Stephen?
Hey, Dave, I can maybe jump in and at least get that conversation started. I serve as the FHWA liaison on our HSM2 project that's funded by, of course, TRB and NCHRP, funded by AASHTO, but managed through the TRB process and NCHRP 17-71A. And so what the current plan is that the HSM second edition will be modified so that if you're familiar with the current edition, Part D will be changed where it actually focuses on how to use and develop crash modification factors and apply those CMFs. And the actual values themselves will no longer be in the actual HSM second edition. They will refer to the CMF clearing access to those HSM2 CMFs. And so there's still a little bit to figure out on how we'll do that, if there'll be some sort of additional designation. Of course, the rating criteria that we're talking about today was done under the auspices of NCHRP 17-72 for the eventual use by the HSM second edition. And so that was done on purpose. The reason that the AASHTO group is looking at putting these CMFs or using the CMF Clearinghouse is so that they can keep those much more live and up to date. Instead of having those in a printed manual that's static, this would be on the website that would be much more current. There still is talk about potentially printing a PDF version that would be sort of a download of the clearinghouse from time to time if people wanted to access that, if they needed that for their own policies and procedures. So those discussions are still happening, but that is sort of the thought as the HSM2 second edition is being currently developed.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Unless there's another add-in here from the other presenters, I'd like to proceed with the other questions here. All right, Jake is asking, will the old rating be displayed or only the new one? Jake, I'll take that. So moving forward, and as of right now, there is a star quality rating provided, the details provided, and these will be based on, and they use the new system that we've described today during the webinar. If you're interested in the old rating, the way to get that information would be to review the archived spreadsheet that we mentioned. Bob is asking, there's a lot of great information presented in today's presentation. Will the slides be available to the attendees? And I do believe it's our intention to provide a recording of this after the completion of today's webinar, and that link will be made available right after, right? Is that right, everyone?
Yep, that is correct, Dave. So a recording of the webinar as well as the presentation slides themselves will be posted to the Clearinghouse website under, I think it's about the CMF Clearinghouse, and then if you drill down, there's a webinars link there where you'll find all that information.
Great, thank you, Karen. We have another question in from Mohammed. Mohammed is asking, so it's up to the practitioner's discretion to consider the new rating or the old rating for the CMFs that have both legacy and updating ratings? I guess, Mohammed, you're asking if users should use both? And I'd like to pose that question to our presenters. John, Karen, Jerry, would you like to take a stab at answering Mohammed's question?
Yeah, when you say use both, I don't think there's any harm in examining both the CMF as it relates to both criteria. It provides information. I think the strength of the new system, as we mentioned before, is it provides added details associated with the study. So I think you're more inclined to gain information using the new 1772 system as compared to the old one. However, I'm not sure I could see a downside to taking a look at the old and the new together. If any of the other panelists want to interject here, it's not hitting me off the top of my head if there's a downside to that.
Yeah, I think you're right, John. This is Jerry. I'll just build on that, I guess. I think you're right. Certainly, as a practitioner, you want to look into how that CMF was evaluated and how it received such a star rating. I would suggest using the new star rating just because it's a more rigorous criteria. You know, going from a 14-point scale to a 150-point scale, to me, would be more helpful to the practitioner. But the one thing I'll mention too is that it always depends on the situation that you're dealing with to select the most appropriate CMF. And so, you know, I'll use an example that perhaps the CMF gets rated as a 3-star study because it only looked at intersections in Georgia. You know, maybe you're looking at left turn lane additions or something like that. Well, if you're looking to build a left turn lane in Georgia, then that study would be that's probably the most appropriate CMF to use, rather than using a CMF study that receives a 5-star rating that looked at you know, a bunch of locations or intersections in the northeast part of the United States. So it certainly is always to beholden of the user and the analyst to select the most appropriate CMF. It's certainly not a cookbook. We're just hopefully giving you some indication at a glance to help you assess which CMFs to look at further, given that there's over 7,000 CMFs in the clearinghouse.
Great, thank you. Another question here from Alamaru Mulugeta Tola. You're asking about any potential impacts to the Federal Highway Administration's Interactive Highway Safety Design Model software. And I'd like to take a stab at answering that. So while IHSDM does include a new feature in version 16 that allows users to provide a crash modification factor on a site, segment, or intersection basis, at this time, we don't have a direct connection between that tool and the clearinghouse. So I'm not seeing at this point an impact that this new transition to an updated star rating system would have on that software. So not sure that there would be one right now, Alamaru. I hope that answers your question. Let's see, another couple questions have come in about the link to.
I think, Dave, too, just maybe before you move on,
yeah,
I think it's maybe again good to point out that we're not changing any of the CMF values that an agency or person might use. We're only changing the star rating.
Yeah, that's right, Jerry. I appreciate you emphasizing that. Yeah, and I do see a couple questions coming in about jurisdictional use of CMFs and how agencies have policies. Mohammed, I see your question. Justin, I see yours. And there's I guess the basis of a few of these questions is that there's almost a policy perhaps in place where only a certain star rating would be acceptable or used. And since many of these CMFs are changing in their star rating, the questions here are asking for our feedback. Does this mean that policies should change, or at least the pre-approved lists? Your thoughts, presenters.
I guess I'll start and let the others jump in. I would say perhaps. I would certainly recommend that you take a look at how this affects your, if you've got a list that has prescribed certain CMF, by ID number or whatever, I would certainly look at that and make sure with those changes, again, about 48% of the CMF value or CMF star ratings have changed. So you would certainly want to look at that. If you had sort of a threshold, like I mentioned before, if three stars or above, you certainly, again, would still want to look to see how that affects your CMFs. In certain areas, we have CMFs that are more challenging to create, particularly if you're looking for a CMF that relates to a pedestrian or bicycle countermeasure. And so sometimes you may have to resort to a 2-star rating study, depending on the situation. So I would definitely take a look at your values and what you're using and your policies, just to make sure and see what impact this changes in the star ratings have had. I think if you had a star rating threshold before, say 3 stars or above, then there's probably even more confidence that in that star rating, because it's a more rigorous analysis that's being performed to score those studies. So.
Great, thank you, Jerry. I see another question here from Dallas. Dallas is asking about, I guess, a number of crash modification factors based on Elvik's work, and maybe some of the research from Elvik, et cetera, that ended up in the Highway Safety Manual. Elvik's work is being cited there, and Dallas is asking if, with this transition, I'm assuming, did we go back and look at those studies that accompanied the CMFs? And Karen, I don't know if you want to attempt a first answer to that. Did we actually go back and look at a lot of the research when implementing this new star rating system?
Yeah, I think we could defer that one to Taha, Dave.
Yes, Karen, I can answer that. So yes, we did go back and look at a bunch of those studies, whichever were available at our disposal. There were still some studies, which we cannot get our hands on, and as such cannot rate those CMFs using the new system, and they are appropriately identified in the clearinghouse. So when you go into the new ratings, it's those CMFs for which we were not able to get our hands on those studies, or on those older studies, we have them identified as they cannot be rated.
Great, thank you, Taha. We've got about another minute left for questions, and I'm just making sure that we've gone through our list here. And if let's see, Matt has a question. Thank you, Matt. He's asking, is it fair to think of the star rating system as a screening tool, and that there remains a lot of great value in reading the actual underlying research before applying the CMF? Presenters, what do you think?
I would say absolutely. I think Matt is right on. You would still want to do that. And again, yep, it's just one indicator that you would want to use in selecting the most appropriate CMF. So 100% agree with him.
Great, thanks. And so I'm seeing one other question here from Mohammed Shahid. Mohammed's asking, from Justin. Justin has a question about maybe only a small percentage of certain CMFs experiencing a decrease in star quality rating. Is that right, that there would only be a few? Justin, I'll take an initial stab at answering that. I would encourage you to take a closer look at some of the slides that John put together and that we have summarized on the CMF Clearinghouse website, including a link to a flyer that does a really great job describing how many CMFs of a certain star quality rating under the previous system have changed now with the new system. And really, it's going to be important to take a look at each individual CMF in order to understand if it's actually changed. With 7,000 plus CMFs, that may not be an easy task. I do appreciate that. I'm not seeing any other new questions that have popped in. And Karen, I'd like to turn it back over to you. You may be muted, Karen.
Oh, yes, I was. Thank you, Dave. I was talking to myself. So I was just saying to thank you all for those great questions. If we do find any that we weren't able to answer today, we will provide some written responses and post those up to the website with the presentation and webinar recording. I just wanted to take a few minutes to highlight a couple of the resources that we talked about today. So these are those flyers that Dave just mentioned, and Justin, one of these flyers has that chart that shows the changes between the star ratings. So I think it's the second one here, but that might not be exactly right. So just check them both out, and it's in one of these flyers, that table that John presented earlier today in today's webinar. In addition to these two flyers that are on the website, we are in the process of developing a quick 4-minute video that highlights a lot of the stuff that we covered here in today's webinar, mainly focused on the new rating criteria, and we walk through an example. And this video can be used in trainings or in outreach to your colleagues or stakeholders or partners that you work with in using crash modification factors in your agency. We are hoping to finalize this video within the next couple of weeks, and it will be posted to the CMF Clearinghouse website as well. I also just wanted to quickly mention our NHI courses specifically related to CMFs. We have 3 web-based courses that are a combination of self-paced web-based training and live web conference training. They focus on applying CMFs, selecting CMFs, and developing CMFs. And we are in the process of updating each of these courses, but hope to offer them again this year. You'll likely see an announcement about the Developing Quality CMFs course this spring, and the other 2 later in the year. So I would encourage you to visit the NHI website to learn about these courses and for additional information about their availability. We do have one last poll that we'd like to get in before the end of today's webinar. So Kelly, if you can open that. We're just looking to see if there's anything else that we can do or that would be helpful to you related to the new rating system. So would more in-depth training on the new system be helpful to you? So maybe like a one-on-one or something that gets into the criteria on a more detailed level. Maybe a question and answer session where it's just like a roundtable discussion and we can just sit around and answer whatever questions you have. Maybe you need some technical assistance to help you read through the changes to the ratings and how that might impact you and your agency. Or maybe you would like a tailored presentation, something like we did today, but for your specific agency. Or maybe you even have a better idea of what would be helpful to you, and you can tell us that in the chat pod. And I'll give you just a few more seconds to respond to this poll, but really after today, if you have any other ideas, if there's anything we can do to help you, you can always reach out to any one of us, and we're happy to help anytime. Okay, Kelly, if you can close that poll and summarize the results, if that's easy to do, I'm not sure.
Yeah, we have around 35 or 36% are more in-depth training on the new system, technical assistance, and presentation. And then 22% said question and answer session, with 4% in the other category.
Okay, so there is definitely, it sounds like some interest in some additional training or technical assistance related to this transition. So we'll see what we can put together to help you and to deliver those resources to you. So I have 2 final things that I wanted to mention. So when you exit the webinar today, a brief survey will load. We would very much appreciate your feedback on our performance today. It helps us to, as we plan other webinars, and especially since we're delivering a very similar webinar for the researchers next week. And then I know you are probably all wondering about a certificate of attendance. After today's webinar, you'll receive an email that will include a link to download a printable certificate of attendance for 1 hour of professional development instruction. So I'm not sure if we're to a point where we have multiple attendees at a site, but if you do, you can forward that link to the other participants so they can download and print that certificate with their name as well. I'd like to thank the CMF Clearinghouse team for all of their help with the transition, and all of you for taking your time to learn more about the CMF Clearinghouse changes today. If you have any questions moving forward, please feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we'll be happy to help. Our contact information is here. If you go to the CMF Clearinghouse website, my email is there as well. So please reach out to us. We're happy to help in any way we can. Thank you all. Have a good day and be safe.